Good evening. I'm Eric Ruberry, President of the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain Library. And on behalf of the library and the Reading League of Women Voters, welcome to Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy. We are honored to have Tina Rosenberg as moderator for this program. A National Book Award and Pulitzer Prize winner, Ms. Rosenberg served on the New York Times editorial board for a decade, and among many other achievements, is co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network. Her New York Times column, Fixes, focuses on exploring solutions to major social problems. Her most recent book is Join the Club: How Peer Pressure Can Transform the World. It is a privilege to have her with us. This program follows a number of collaborative conversations organized by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library, whose partnership in this endeavor began in 2019. The series is brought to you in association with Easton Public Library, Western Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown's C.H. Booth Library, the League of Women Voters of Weston, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County, and in partnership with media sponsor WSHU Public Radio. It's pretty impressive if you ask me. And the importance of this series starts with its name, I believe, Conversations. It is easy to forget that there have always been more to both our community and social issues than mere argument. It is easy to forget that we can have deep differences, yet still collectively strive with the strengths we share. America was founded on disagreements, and our commitment to resolving them sometimes first starts with dialogue. We are glad to be a part of this endeavor. Now, we are recording tonight's program, so feel free to let your friends and neighbors know, especially if they're not able to join us tonight, since the recording of this program will be available to view in a few days on the Mark Twain Library's YouTube channel. There will be time for questions towards the end, and you are welcome to put your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We are also offering closed caption, and buttons for both of these functions are on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so now, friends and neighbors, it is a privilege this evening to welcome Tina Rosenberg to Conversations.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thanks so much to the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters for hosting what I hope will be a fascinating hour and a half with two very interesting thinkers who I will introduce now. We will have Dr. Jelani Cobb. He is an historian, author, journalist, and professor whose focus is race, the police, and injustice. He currently teaches at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. He also serves as a frontline correspondent and a New Yorker staff writer. Dr. Cobb's most recent book is The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress. He was a 2018 Pulitzer Prize finalist in commentary, and he won the 2015 Sidney Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis Journalism. Dr. Cobb is prominently featured in the Oscar-nominated documentary 13th about the current mass incarceration of Black Americans, which traces the subject to its historical origins in the 13th Amendment. Welcome, Dr. Jelani Cobb. We will also welcome Dr. Jason Stanley. He is a philosopher, author, professor, and expert on fascism who writes about authoritarianism, propaganda, free speech, and mass incarceration, among other topics. He is currently a professor of philosophy at Yale University and contributes articles to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Review, the Guardian, and other publications. His most recent book is How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. Dr. Stanley is winner of the 2007 American Philosophical Association Book Prize and the 2016 Prose Award for the subject area of philosophy. Welcome to Dr. Jason Stanley. I'm going to use your first names if I may. So thank you both for being here. And I would like to start us off with a question that I think is foremost in most people's minds, which is that we are currently in a situation in the United States where, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, everybody not only has their own opinions, but they also have their own facts. There is no shared basis of understanding in the United States and actually across the world. The United States is only a medium level polarized country. There are a lot of countries that are far worse, including those that have stronger institutions than ours. How did we get here? Why now?
I'm going to let Jelani take that first because he's a historian.
Jason, it's good to see you and have you put me on the hook. And Tina, it's good to be here with you as well. You know, I mean, it's interesting because we talked about how we got here politically. There are a few dynamics, I think, that go into this. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and you know, for the shameless plug, I have an article on this very thing coming out in next week's New Yorker, is that, you know, there are two consequential things that happened in 1965. One was the Voting Rights Act, and the other was the Hart-Sellers Immigration Reform Act. And both of those things had a similar effect. They were united in the sense that they changed the demography of the United States. The Voting Rights Act did not, you know, increase the number of African Americans who were here. It increased the ability of the people who were already here to register their voices and their perspectives through through voting and running for political office. And the 1965 Act reversed the eugenic, racist 1924 Johnson Immigration Restriction Act, and literally changed the complexion of American immigration. And so between those two things, we saw the processes that began accelerating into the 21st century, where they reached a critical mass in 2016, and we saw the reemergence of overt white nationalist politics, something that we thought we'd left behind in the middle of the 20th century. But, you know, I talk with my students about this. I say historians tend to view the past differently than kind of normal people, right? People who are, better, maybe have a better sense of things than we do. But we tend to look at the past not as, static or as an inert set of events that transpired long ago. But we look at the past more like the way that meteorologists look at weather. And so under the right circumstances, if you have the right amount of humidity and the right temperature, you will see snow. And there are climatological factors you can understand that will make the probability of snow increase or decrease. And we're looking at the same sorts of dynamics that produced those white nationalist upsurges in the 19th century and 20th century. And one of which is, other thing I tell my students very often, so we talk about voter suppression in the South, when we think about the classic Jim Crow era, the concern, we've kind of done a disservice in saying that the goal was to eliminate Black people from voting because of racism. And I was like, sure, racism was part of it, but there's another part of it, which was just plain pragmatism. They were most committed to voter suppression in the places where there were the most Black people. They also knew that Black people were not going to vote for the same things that they were going to vote for. And so it was racism bound to a pragmatic end. Now we're seeing those same sorts of concerns. People are looking around and seeing, 20 years ago, there were 39 states that had majority white Christian populations. Now they're fewer than half. In 1996, white people made up 81% of the electorate. In 2018, we don't know what the number was for 2020, but in 2018, that was just 67%. And so we're seeing these sorts of demographic concerns that are like the climatological conditions we saw before. And that's one of the reasons we're seeing the kind of polarized politics that we're seeing now. I will leave to Jason to talk about the epistemological crises that we're confronting, and I'll defer. I gave some historical context, and I will defer to you to give some philosophical context.
Thank you, Jelani.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jelani. I think the epistemological crisis is obviously related to the factors about race that Jelani discusses. Racial hierarchy is itself a delusion, a kind of myth. When you have people committed to racial hierarchy, when you have people committed to this idea that, the dominant group is the victim, think of male reaction to feminism, panic about female equality. Oh no, there's only 86 male senators. Something like, so that kind of commitment to the dominant group is a foundational myth that when it comes under threat, destabilizes people's sense of identity. So I want to raise, so we should get back to that question of that Jelani raised that has downstream epistemological consequences, that when you're a member of the dominant group and you feel that your dominance might be threatened, however, by encroaching equality, however far off that equality may be, it disorients you. And you're already committed to this fictional world anyway, where you should be at the center. But I want to point out that, so Jelani's a US historian, but we're seeing this around the world. First of all, I want to take issue with the frame of polarization. I think it's a very dangerous frame. We can use it and use the sort of technical phrase asymmetric polarization. But the Republican Party, if it were in Europe, would be just to the left of Golden Dawn. which is it's the most extreme far right major. It's the Republican Party in its current form, by every political science major, is not just an extremist far right party. It's on the extreme of the far right. So the Republican Party has become, we've shifted as a country very far to the right. And so that's gonna, so if we look at it as polarization, people disagreeing, rather than looking at it as what are the contents of the disagreements, what are the facts, then we risk actually normalizing very extreme things. And we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't do the thing where we're like, oh, let's meet in the middle, when the middle has shifted so far to the right in this country. And just a last point about the world. If the far right, the neo-fascist movements are rising everywhere. Take India, the world's largest democracy. BJP, which runs the country in a dominant, they have the prime minister, the parliament, the Hindu nationalists. In 1992, they were an extremist, violent, a quasi-violent organization. Now they're the major political party, the Hindu nationalists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is true about the frame of this. And one of the other interesting things about this is that, when you go back, and Marsha Barrett, who's a historian at the University of Illinois, has this great book on Nelson Rockefeller coming out. She and I had a dialogue about this. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that if you stripped away the names and just went back to the archives and read the concern within the Republican Party about the rise of Barry Goldwater in 1962, 1963, 1964, it was astoundingly similar. People made the same sorts of concerns or claims. They said that there's a group that Richard Nixon referred to as kooks. He said that Barry Goldwater was going to bring all of the kooks into the party. They talked about the John Birch Society in the same context that people were talking about QAnon. And the same sort of hostility towards civil rights and the invitation of racial antagonism. And the party was convinced, their kind of correspondence going back and forth, that they would become a essentially ultra-nationalist party with limited appeal, with the potential or likelihood of having violent elements within. And they dodged that bullet in 1964 because Goldwater was so thoroughly trounced by Lyndon Johnson. But they wound up in the same place. It was the same sort of the accuracy of the prediction, just the timing was off. And so I think the other point about this is in kind of relationship to those global currents. I think there's an idea that I have about this, which is that our knowledge of history tends to be like immunity that is passed down for one generation, or within the generation of people who have lived experience. And one of the things I think that is kind of illustrative of that is our concern about vaccines and the ideas about vaccines and the kind of vaccine truthers. That is because most of us don't have living knowledge of polio. And that, within the generation of people who actually knew what polio was like and saw what polio did, they would have a much more skeptical view of people saying that vaccines were going to be ruinous. And I think that when we look at what fascism has done globally and how it has operated, we have approached that same sort of limit of biological immunity, the point at which we know kind of in lived experience, what exactly these ideologies are. Not to mention, the end of the Cold War, the kind of unchecked globalism and all the things that kind of have fed into what they are calling populist movements, but really ultranationalist and fascist movements. And so I think Jason's absolutely right on that.
I want to get back to the why now, because I think if we can talk about what is causing the rise of polarization, fascism now, then we can talk about what has to change. But the examples, the first historical examples you cited, Jelani, were from 1965, which was 56 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, as we said, not just a American phenomenon. South Korea right now is the most polarized country in the world. There's no immigrants in South Korea, and they have perfectly well-functioning government. What is going on? And is there anything that's going on that is changeable, that we have some control over?
Could I take this one first, Jelani?
Sure.
Please, Jason.
So again, I'm just going to reiterate, I'm not happy about the term polarization. What matters, there's going to be lots, I'm not familiar with a particular situation in South Korea, but you could have a completely non-polarized society where everyone's an ethno-nationalist fascist. When you have widespread fundamental disagreement, if you have people who think the United States is a Christian country, first and foremost, and everyone else is here as a guest, well, as a Jewish American, I'm going to say, no, that's wrong. I don't think we should call that polarization. I think that we should call that ideologies, problematic, anti-democratic ideologies. And I think the problem we face is not polarization. The problem we face is problematic, anti-democratic ideologies. We say polarization because it sounds non-judgmental. Oh, you're polarized, I'm polarized, hey, but the problem
like
is
we're all Geminis.
Right, exactly. You want to be polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. What's a bad thing is to have one of the poles be white nationalism.
I think it's interesting, this is a kind of point in this that, we've heard a great deal about the rhetoric now, a kind of resurgent idea of America as a Christian nation, which, theologically, there would be a whole array of Black theologians who would have a field day, with those points, because despite that, they never seem to have any problem with lynching American Christians if they were Black, or blowing up Christian houses of worship if there were Black people who were praying in there. And so, I mean, that's a whole, I think, other point of it. Now, to the South Korean example, I don't know what the particulars are, but I will say that as in watching CPAC, I made a mental note of it because I saw just how prominent South Korea was in the discussions there. They were constantly going, South Korea, and then they mentioned that there had been a CPAC convention in South Korea. And I was saying to myself, okay, I have to dig into this, to see, if there's a story here, or, something, next thing for the New Yorker maybe is about that, because it was striking to me that was happening. But, I do think that there is something to the kind of post-Cold War global tides of hyper-capitalism and severe inequality that is also exacerbating this, and that is being siphoned over into ethno-resentments in ways that are very familiar. And I don't, I don't think, first off, we can start by saying that there are arguments that are actually, valid about the exploitation of people. Just as, in the United States in the 19th century, the populist movement had some really great points in terms of the way the farmers are being exploited. It's just that, in their later incarnations, they also wanted to lynch Black people, which, obviously I would take issue with. But I think that that's part of the dynamic that we're seeing take place globally as well.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Another why now question. We have seen in the past year an explosion of, the movement for racial justice has exploded. Why now? And what do you see as the future of that? Jelani, let's start with you.
No, I'm going to defer to Jason. Well, I don't think that it's now. So I think that these things have been going on, and they've been fermenting for a minute. And I think that there are some things, I think historians will be sorting this out for a minute, and sociologists are looking at, this kind of information now. But there are two dynamics that I think are immediate, twin dynamics. One is technology, and, the ability, like George Floyd. I've been covering, police, use of force, excessive force, police violence, brutality for 25 years at this point. And I think I'm jaded in a certain way, because when I saw the George Floyd video, which was horrific, I just said nothing is going to happen. I'd seen the Tamir Rice video. I'd been in Ferguson. I'd seen the Eric Garner video. I'd seen too many of these videos, and I just thought nothing would happen. And I was stunned by the way that people reacted. And I think it was precisely because he was not shot. Those other people were shot. Eric Garner was strangled, but that was kind of obscured. You couldn't really see what was going on. Here, we simply saw 8 minutes and 46 seconds of someone being extinguished. And I think that people who were not aware that we lived in a country where something like that could happen were shocked into the understanding that it could. And that was part of the reaction we got. And that was purely because of technology and social media. The other part of it is, I think, conversely, rising expectations. There's a dynamic where when you have periods where people don't expect much to happen, there's comparatively little resistance. But when people believe there's actually an option for things to be different and they don't turn out differently, it sparks a kind of disappointment boomerang effect. And it's not coincidental that the Black Lives Matter movement emerged under the first Black president. Because, the first thing they ever wrote for the New Yorker was a piece called Trayvon Martin and the Parameters of Hope. And it was about the fact that Trayvon Martin had happened while there was a Black president in the White House. And that being represented at the highest echelon of American political power still would not insulate you from these sorts of offenses or these sorts of violations. And that was what made people say, oh, well, if there are limits to what can be attained through electoral politics, then we have to go back to the other thing, which is the politics of being out in the street. And I think those are parts of the dynamics. Now, some of it is generational as well, and probably a stew of other things that'll factor in there.
Do you think something different is going to happen?
Potentially. So I think that it's kind of like how the Democrats are in Congress right now, or the smart ones, who are trying to get everything they can in a 2-year window, because the world may be very different then. For people who are cynical about the potential for change, it was interesting to me when I started seeing Black Lives Matter knock off prosecutors, when they would get out into the street and start saying, oh, we don't want this person to be a prosecutor, to be the DA anymore. Typically, DAs are only concerned with the more conservative voters. And, kind of lock them up is the call of the day. But when you saw a movement on the left that was actually able to, I think it was 3 different DAs that got dispatched in their re-election bids, I was like, oh, okay, this is different. This is not what we've seen. We also just saw, the repeal of 50A in New York, where you can no longer shield the disciplinary records of police officers. which is a huge development, where you literally don't know, what a police officer has done in his career. We'll see what happens with this George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and what comes of that. But I think that there are these moments that offer you brief windows to maximize everything that you can get, and in those points, in those times, you really try to run up the score before the tides change and you're dealing with a different reality.
Yeah. Jason, you look like you're
Yeah,
a bit.
well, yeah, I mean, it's just Jelani setting out in I mean, the thing is, Jelani you must be exhausted because there's so many top points like this. And at each point like this, you're called on to say, what about now? And it must be exhausting to be Jelani Cobb. It must be exhausting to be a Black public intellectual in America when my colleague Elizabeth Hinton is coming out with a book arguing that there have been thousands
That's right.
of revolutions since the 1960s, and she thinks of them as revolutions. The revolutions against a militarized police force. And to connect with Jelani's earlier point, why do we have militarized police forces? Because we have massive inequality in cities, and you've got to keep the nice neighborhoods separate from the poor neighborhoods. So you need a police force that is militarized and can keep the poor neighborhood from the rich neighborhood, and these are all racialized distinctions, and so this is the old history, and so distinguishing and LA in 1992, I mean, and then what Hinton does is she shows that there's many uprisings against this situation. So the sense in which I've had many friends, I won't name them, who just during Black Lives Matter were like, I'm tired, I can't do this, I can't get the hope thing again. But I think that, and I do think that Black Lives Matter was a mass political movement this time around that affected the election in a million different ways, connecting with labor, connecting with, I think they helped win the election.
Right.
So.
And I'll add, I have Elizabeth Hinton's manuscript over here in the pile on my desk, which you can't see. And it's really, really, America on Fire is the title of it. And it's really an excellent manuscript, and will be out this summer. The other thing that I would add to that is Carol Anderson's forthcoming book, which I think is called The Second. But it's about the Second Amendment, the racial origins of the Second Amendment. And that factors into this, where we have this language about self-defense being sacrosanct, but their understanding of self-defense and the requirement that you have arms at the ready for the entire society was directly connected to the fact that these were people who were living around, particularly in places like South Carolina and Mississippi, the majority of your population, which has been enslaved. And so if you have, in John Sell, that kind of classic 1980 book, The Highest Stage of White Supremacy, talks about that, the kind of prerogatives that are, or rather prerequisites that are imposed upon a society in which the minority is exploiting and oppressing the majority. And one of those things is that you have a highly militarized society. And so that's part of how we get this gun culture and this gun tradition, not surprisingly, it's steeped mostly in the American South. And so those two dynamics are would predictably lead to the kind of end that we see right now. One of the most cogent arguments that I've heard from someone on the right, actually, was the fact that he said one of the reasons you see so many police shootings is that American police live in a society and operate and work in a society where reasonably they could expect every single person they encounter to have a gun. And it was like, and they are jumpy and trigger happy as a result of it. And I was like, that doesn't explain everything. You still have a requirement to, you have much more training and all these other kinds of things, but you do understand how people could look around and say, does this person have a gun? Does that person have a gun? Because more guns than people in the country.
Jason, there's another factor there that you have talked about, which is the way journalism covers crime. I'd like to talk about journalism, and let's start out by asking the non-journalists. How does that play into?
Right. So this is I think one of the most significant problems, failings of American journalism in the last 30 years. Certainly on, well, we won't get into the Iraq War, but certainly on domestic policy. So the kind of politics that gets run, that often that demagogues run, is a kind of law and order politics. They run against rising violent crime. The media has not reported on one of the most important stories in domestic American history, which is the enormous drop in violent crime since the very early 1990s. It's been completely not reported on. So, Trump in 2016, he ran on supposed rising crime. He cleverly would talk about the raise in the crime rate, because if you have 300, like New York City had 2,100, 2,200 murders in 1991. In 2015, they had like 310, and it went up to like 330. And that's a big rate rise from 310 to 330 percentage-wise, because the number's so small. But we're talking absolute historic declines in violent crime. Violent crime is slightly shifted up, but we're still, compared to the late 80s, the early 90s, these are historic times, and the media has completely failed to report on that. And as a result, politicians are able to run campaigns against violent crime because the media focuses on isolated, lurid cases of violent crime. Very few Americans are aware that we are living in a time, any violent crime is a tragedy, but we're living in a time among the lowest rates of violent crime in American history.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Tina.
No, go ahead, Jelani.
No, it's like the dog that didn't bark.
Right. I think I'm going to say something now. There's a couple of reasons. One is it's a gradual. There's no event that to cover in terms of the drop in violent crime, but also the media does tend to consider its brief as covering what's going wrong. So shootings get covered, but I think the consequences are far worse than what you've described. It has set the narrative about marginalized communities. All we know about them is their worst stereotype, because that is what the media reports on. TV news, what you see is shootings. You don't see anything else. There are no other Black faces on TV news except for shootings in most cases. And so that is how the narrative gets formed by that. The same thing is true with the rural South. We go do stories about the rural South and we look for the people with 4 teeth. Well, they exist, but there's also plenty of people who have all their teeth and who are doing interesting and exciting and smart things, and we just don't report on that. So, this is a narrative that the media creates. It's a racially unjust narrative that makes all other racial injustice possible.
That's true. I also think that some of this is kind of baked into the way that stories get done. And I'm talking with my students about this all the time. When you have a story to do and you need to report, and there are 2 options. You can get the police report, which is made easy for you because there is a public information officer at the precinct who will get that report into your hot little hands as quickly as need be. Or you can go track down the guy who was standing on the corner when it happened. And then you find that you have an old address, that you were able to scrounge up, or you only know his nickname and you're trying to find a guy named Scooter, somewhere. And it's like, it becomes a much more involved process, which is why it's important to cover a story all the way through.
Yeah.
The version that you're able to get, which relies predictably on official news channels or official information channels, is skewed toward the establishment. And it takes time to actually report out that story that says, and as a matter of fact, the George Floyd story is a great example of it. We were just talking about it, where there's no mention of the asphyxiation, obviously, in the report. And so when you see the video, you see exactly what happened to this man. And so there are kind of these built-in things about the way that we proceed as journalists that produce these outcomes.
The other effect of this is to make, and I'm going to use a word you don't like, polarization worse than it actually is, because journalists tend to cover politics by looking for the most obnoxious extreme views on both sides and quoting them. And so that's what we think the other side thinks. That's actually not true. I mean, there are a shockingly and horrifyingly large number of people who have those views, but they're not the majority of the Republican Party. And people who just rely on the media to understand those views don't understand that, and vice versa. It's like we're not actually in a national death match of racists versus snowflakes, but that's the way the media portrays it.
But I do think there's something to this, though, because one of the kind of disturbing things about Trump and Trumpism is that he was not a resignation candidate like Mitt Romney in 2012, or even John McCain in 2008. You could say Bob Dole in 1996, where Republicans were like, oh, well, okay, this is the guy. It's like when you're at the airport and you go to the car rental and like the only thing they have is that one, mid-size, oh, well, I guess this is what I'm driving, and so people who viewed those candidates in that way. Trump was a full-throated, hearty, fanatically endorsed, wildly beloved figure who colonized the party, and not only that, was able to exert his will to punish anyone who deviated from what he thought within the ranks. And that is as good a barometer of what the party believes as anything.
Jason?
Well, so I'm going to go back to so Tina, you said, so the media is responsible for polarization. They report on these extreme views on both sides, and they're horrifying. What exactly is the horrifying view on the Democratic side? I didn't catch that.
I'm saying that many Republicans, I see your point, many Republicans think that all Democrats are the caricature that they believe. And that's not true. Some are, but some aren't. Just like some people on the right have fascist views, but most don't. But we are not seeing the people who are closer to the middle. I'm not saying the media causes polarization. I'm saying we make it seem worse than it is.
I'm just not seeing it. Sorry. There are a lot of people in America with fascist views, many more than there should be. In the Democratic Party, are there leftist authoritarians who seek to put everyone in re-education camps? No, there are not. So reality is very important. Like if we lose reality, like we have to look at the myths. It's true there are Democrats who are socialist. That's true. But I would argue that socialism is very different from QAnon. I would argue that it's not some kind of extremist polarized view. Our socialists are center-left candidates in any European country.
I mean, I think that consistent 90% approval rate that Trump held within the Republican Party, even as he did further and further extreme things on the right is indicative here. Also, right now, there are something like 400 voter suppression bills floating around in Republican legislatures. And so I will say this, if not everyone in the Republican Party believes that these fascistic things, I will say enough of them do to present a real credible threat to democracy.
And let's be, Tina, the reason I'm being insistent here is because I think some of the comments you're making are making what I think is a terrible error the media does, normalization. By constantly saying extremists on both sides, Bernie Sanders and Trump. Those are very different figures.
I agree with you. I'm not saying, I'm just saying that each side has an inaccurate view of what the other side believes. I'm not trying to compare Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. I agree with you on that.
I'm not 100% sure that each side has, I don't think that's true. I think that I spend a lot of time on far right, many Republicans are not, the Republican Party has shrunk its base. Many people who were Republicans when I was younger are not Republicans anymore. They've become independents, but the Republican Party has become a far right party. And so that's not, and it has many people with far right views.
Well, I'm sorry. One of the interesting things to Jason's point, one of the interesting stories that I think toward the media report, I think that one of the things the media did not cover effectively was the fact that the Republican Party typically has a smaller registered voter base than the Democratic Party does. And turnout, of course, becomes the key equalizer. And then there's an even smaller group of independents. But last year, for the first time, there were more registered independents than there were registered Republicans.
Right.
And one of the factors are that, the Republican Party is shedding those folk. The people who are the Nelson Rockefellers, or the people who like to think of themselves as fiscally conservative and socially liberal. That version of the Republican Party has been really quite at odds for a long time, and there've been a whole array of people making quiet or not so quiet exits. And so I think that there's something to this kind of run to the right. And then since we've jumped through history and philosophy, I'll cite the political science. But my friend Tom Patterson, the political scientist, was the recent book that just came out called "Is the Republican Party Destroying Itself?" really charts the way that the South has driven the party to the right. He places this as geographic and says, and the South is always, when the South was in the Democratic Party, it had an outsized influence because of the Electoral College and some other things, of Black voter suppression, et cetera. It really pulled the Democratic Party to the right and nationally, exerted that gravitational influence on FDR and all the things that we've seen, until Lyndon B. Johnson, broke with the South, famously. And now they do the same thing to the Republican Party. 70% of the safe Republican seats in this country are in the South. And when we see, the South remains, it's a stereotype, but the South remains the most racist section of the United States. It remains the least educated section of the United States. It remains the most belligerent in terms of gun ownership and the most violent. And it's part of what we're seeing in the Republican Party.
And also so there's this complexity here about the domestic situation and the international situation. Internationally, the far right has vastly grown since the 1990s. 3 of the 4 largest democracies, well, not anymore because Trump is, but Brazil and India are run by extreme far. Modi, when he was the head of Gujarat, wasn't allowed in the United States because he was considered an extremist. Now he runs India. Israel Netanyahu is ever further to the right. All across Europe, far-right parties have been ascendant. The UK, United States. So there's these local factors, but then there's all these international factors. Like recently, I was on one of these programs, and I was talking about the history of voter suppression in the United States. It was with Omar Wazo, and Omar Wazo said, actually, the techniques being used by the Republicans, they're consulting with Hungarians. They're not actually the old techniques. Exactly. Hungary has perfected the art of, fake elections. Hungary Poland's doing it. You have the far right. You have these mechanisms to take over elections. So we're seeing this as well. We're seeing international, and it's funded by, the Robert Mercers of the world.
I would like to get to some of the very interesting questions we have here from people who have joined us today. And let's start with one that's for a historian. It seems that this current generation of students are engaged in social and political issues in a way that reminds me of the 1960s. You see parallels or differences?
Both. I think that, and you could say, the generation before them, the 1960s students who saw people in the 1930s, who were kind of radicalized by their experiences in the Great Depression, and kind of created the old left. And so I think that, there are these kind of cyclical developments that we see in response to very real dynamics. At the same time, we do have a different circumstance. We're not on the end of catastrophic global war. More significantly, we don't have an expanding economy. We have the opposite. We have staggering wealth inequality. That middle third of the 20th century, where that great expansion of the middle class happened, also coincided with the civil rights movement. So kind of Black people are able to attain some of these benefits and access right as the party was about to end. But there was fundamentally not a question about there being enough to go around. That's not the question we're looking at now. And I think that that's a very different kind of thing. Also, I think that people have evolved. When we look at the questions that people are asking, it's now not that we have a civil rights movement, we have a women's movement, that we have a gay rights movement, that we have a peace movement. People are looking on all of these fronts. They understand the connections between them. My students are far more sophisticated than I was at their age on these things. And you really can't get anything by them. And so I think there's a real quality level with the thinking of young people that I see now that I think is probably different from preceding generations.
Yeah. Glad to hear that. Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's stunning what's happening generationally. It's stunning, and the anti-woke hysteria of the New York Times editorial board, various members of that, and oh my God, that part of it is just not understanding a large part of it is not understanding what's going on. The youth. The youth are much more. I mean, what Jelani said is reflecting of the kind of teaching we do, because our students teach us, because they see the interconnected ways in which capitalism leads to exploitation and racism and sex. I mean, I think climate change has to be mentioned here as a my students, the students that I talk to are highly critical of capitalism, at Yale, which really would not be the case 10 years ago. And I think that's climate change, because climate change makes it impossible. It's such a salient issue for this generation that criticizing capitalism is on the table in a way that for Jelani and my generation was much less so.
I mean, I think even with our generation, we were coming of age at a point where capitalism was doing victory laps around the globe.
Right.
And so kind of any critique of capitalism made people think that you were a dinosaur, like, this is what's on the table for dinner, you have it or go hungry. And I think that these are younger people who don't see those alternatives in that way.
So this is a question from a gentleman who sent in five questions before this event. Speaking of anti-woke, he says, Ibram Kendi informs us that there is no middle area between racism and anti-racism. If you are not anti-racist, then you're being racist. In light of this, is there any form of criticism of your work and of your outlook that is not in itself racist? If there are no permitted adversarial viewpoints, how are the inevitable flaws and errors in your thinking identified and corrected? Is the intellectual pursuit of truth also a racist undertaking?
No.
I mean, these are these spreadings of false information about what people think. I mean, this is it's part of a look at this terrifying, anti-racist movements are threatening civilization, they're threatening reason and rationality, but it is a complete misrepresentation of the viewpoints in question. So, it's hard to engage when look, it's always, this is not new, this thing of representing the dangerous leftists, and it's always in the United States. Black equality movements are part of that. So the campuses are always supposed to be the site of the. I mean, so what I'm addressing is the fact that what this questioner thinks is happening isn't happening, and so this is not. So you're asking us to respond to something that neither of us believes or encounters, except
nor does Ibram.
Nor, of course, right? Yeah, of course.
And I will say that Ibram grew up in the same neighborhood as me, as in Queens, which makes me contractually obligated to not disagree with him in public. But I'm joking about that. That is humor, actually. If I disagreed with him, I would say so. But what I think he was saying, which is a fairly non-controversial comment in other contexts, is if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. That's all he said.
I mean, look at what's happening in the United States with this. What they've done, there's always this boogeyman, and in the United States, it always involves Black equality, movements for Black equality. And the boogeyman is supposed to be this threat to American identity, this terrifying threat. But now we've got multiple states trying to push through bills to ban social justice teaching, to ban anti-racism. And again, this is international. In Brazil, they're doing it with gender ideology and cultural Marxism. Hungary did it. They banned the teaching of gender studies. In the United States, of course, it's going to be critical race theory. But internationally, it's a political strategy. And in every one of these countries, they're saying, take the minority group's trying to destroy the nation, The women are, it's feminism is very central here. They attack, they say, so this is, in the United States, it's going to take this form. But the ideas that that the questioner thinks are out there aren't out there.
Thank you. Another question that brings up something we have shockingly not mentioned, which is social media. When it comes to progressive policy and more local politics, conservative opposition often appears much louder on social media. How do we protect democracy from, and she has in quotes, problematic anti-democratic ideologies when they are so amplified by a technology embedded in our daily lives?
Sounds like you, Jelani.
No, that actually sounds like you. That sounds a lot like you. You wrote the book about propaganda, how propaganda works. No, but so I do think, there's been this argument on the right, which has been curious, where people are saying to break up the tech companies. Because prior to that, they were talking about property being sacrosanct, and the virtue of capitalist success and acquisition. And when things seem to not go in their favor, when a person in the form of Jack Dorsey from Twitter decided that Donald Trump had violated the terms of his business and refused to let him have any further access to it, all of a sudden that changed and went in the opposite direction. And it reminded me of when, in response to protests about police excessive use of force, the NYPD said they were going to stop making routine arrests. That was their protest. And so that was the equivalent of me telling my daughter, I'm going to punish you. Here, take this piece of cake, because it was exactly the thing that people were asking for. And so on the other side, there's long been, anybody who's seen, what's happened in Hungary, for one example, what happened with the Rohingya Muslims, what happened, we go through the whole list of them. Of course, these tech companies need to be broken up, and there need to be serious constraints about it. But now it's only when this has kind of become a personal grudge that people on the right have been able to recognize that this creates a problem. And then finally, the final thing I'll say about it is that the absurdity of saying that Trump's banning is the reason that people have come to this perspective. There's effectively no difference between what happened with Donald Trump and someone saying, no Catholic jokes in my bar, get out, I'm Catholic. You can't tell Catholic jokes in here. Go get your drinks elsewhere. Private property. You can do with it as you will.
Jason? You're muted.
I'm muted. I don't have much to add.
Okay, we'll move on. This is another question. This question for Jason that goes back to wokeness. For Jason, the polarization is not just between right-wingers and Sanders-type socialists. Some classic liberals, as well as some Republicans, see us as faced with fascist extremes, both on the right and among extreme woke activists who would sacrifice First Amendment protections of free expression to police, quote, hate speech, unquote. Michael Powell's New York Times investigation of Smith College, for example, drove home the reasons for fear about the consequences of extreme woke practices, including among well-meaning liberal administrations. Might this perspective help you see the usefulness of polarization among those who care about class and classic liberal values?
So I would say, first of all, I want to say it has always been a fact about humans that sometimes they do idiotic things and act idiotically. So that's a general truth. It's not new right now. Now, is there some massive leftist authoritarian ideology that is threatening liberalism? Is that happening? Well, here's a fact. It's always said that it's happening. In 1993, it used to be called political correctness. you know, the 60s, the campuses were you know, the center of sort of worrisome leftist revolutionaries. I wouldn't use fashion. Just as a point of terminology, there's left-wing authoritarianism, but I wouldn't call it fascism. Fascism is always right-wing. If you care about free speech now, the issue is the many states that are seeking to ban the teaching of anti-racism, ban the teaching of social justice, ban the teaching of the things that supposedly woke ideology involves. If you look internationally, you will see that the hysteria about wokeness of this thing is a right-wing strategy used in country after country after country. Viktor Orban used it. Viktor Orban used it to drive Central European University out of the country. He said Central European University is trying to indoctrinated students with gender ideology and cultural Marxism. He banned the teaching of gender ideology of gender studies in all of Hungary. Brazil is the right wing's attacking their universities with the same vocabulary and the same language. So this is in the UK is doing free speech commissions to ban the teaching of anti-patriotic thought in UK universities. So this idea that so in legislature after legislature, state legislatures here, country after country, India, Brazil, as well as UK, we're getting people saying, we're getting right-wing governments saying, we have to prevent, you know, there's a crisis, the leftists are in charge, you know, they're doing these terrible things. Now, you know, I'm sure there are some annoying things people do in the name of values that I like, and I'll criticize them if they come to my attention. But in general, I think too many people are getting fired because of their speech in journalism, I think, you know, there are. But on, you know, most professors that I know are bland Democratic, you know, Clinton supporters who thought Sanders was pretty radical, and you know, universities are not full of dangerous radicals trying to. Universities are filled with people trying to raise large endowments.
Thank you. Different subject. Question from somebody who is present and viewing. Would the universal basic income ameliorate some of these problems? And please address the larger context. Jason, you have said that one solution to this is basically getting people what they need, that would in fact diminish this these conspiracy theories and fascist views. But you see the rise of fascism even in countries like Sweden.
Yes.
So can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, that happened to me in a panel in the UK when I was doing the economic anxiety thing. I was like, the elites failed us with the Iraq War, and Asa Wickfors, a Swedish philosopher and public intellectual, was there, and she said, Jason, the elites didn't fail anyone in Sweden, and there's a Swedish fascist party, the Sweden Democrats are. So, you know, I fall into this because there's been such clear elite failures in the United States. There, you know, Trump rightly called our attention to some of them, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, the massive inequality. But Tina, you're absolutely right about the importance of the Swedish example. It can't just be, there's something international going on with the right. There's something about normalization going on where xenophobic, ultranationalist, ethno-nationalist parties that are married to, unlike in the past, are married to neoliberal tax-cutting agendas are rising. And what the explanation for this is, well, part of it has to be domestic, but I do think a part of it is part of the international stuff is international.
There's an American corollary that I want to talk about with this too. Like with my students, often confound them because we'll spend a good block of time looking at Orville Faubus and George Wallace, and all of these kind of rising figure, or these kind of marquee figures of right-wing reactionary racial politics of the mid-20th century. And then I would say to them, take away race, and you all would probably vote for every one of those guys. They believed in strong social safety nets. They believed in workers' protections. They believed in activist government. The government had a role in creating prosperity. They believed in a version of equality. They would oppose the kind of radical income equality we have now. The distinction is they did not want Black people to have any of those things. And if given the choice between those things or the absence of them, if it meant that Black people would also be absent for them, they took the latter. And so one of the things that Michael Kazin, the historian of populism, said that I thought was a really chilling point was that the greatest expansion of the social safety net in the United States happened in that middle third of the 20th century, when there were no immigrants coming to the United States. The 1924 bill had squeezed the faucet shut, and Black people were by and large excluded. And so we would have a social safety net, but for us. And when I say us, I mean not me. And so that idea and the kind of present resonance that we see, that's one of the reasons that the Tea Party didn't emerge until Barack Obama was elected. All of those grievances that they pointed to preceded Obama. And they started by making this economic critique of what the banks were doing, which you could start to understand, but then they start calling Obama a monkey. It was like, wait, what does that have to do with this? And it was like, oh, that's what this is. And so when people would talk about the economic despair that people were actually feeling, I would say it's not simply the economic despair. Like, they understand these things in relative terms, not in absolute terms. And so it's not how bad am I doing, but how bad am I doing in relation to these other people who I think who I believe are above me. And we saw in poll after poll that growing plurality of white people who throughout the course of the Obama era thought that Black people were more prosperous than white people in the United States, which has no bearing. There's no data point you can find. You can watch as many rap videos as you want. I guarantee you that is not a reflective of what the economic hierarchy is in the United States. But people absorbed that idea and they were willing to tank the whole thing. And that's why, to wrap this up, at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th century, we saw a populist movement that arose that demanded that people put constraints on powerful institutions like banks. And Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, and all these kinds of things that were popular with people. At the beginning of the 21st century, we saw a populist movement arise in response to the same dynamics that wanted no constraints on those institutions. And so what was the difference between then and now is that they were thinking about where that wealth would have to be divided.
Yeah.
So your point earlier about the expanding pie that we had earlier on that we don't have now, would the universal basic income or other an effective social safety net, would that reduce racism?
No, because I think people will not go for a social safety net if they think that Black and brown people are going to also get one.
Yeah, I mean, that might be too pessimistic, Jelani. It's not because then there's no. I mean, so Jelani's absolutely right that the Republican Party has created this structure of plausible deniability around white supremacy, where people can be like, I'm just for cutting taxes. So it's a great, it's a very successful structure that, because what you do is you link government funds your money to Black people. And then people can say, oh, I'm just anti-government. I have no racial animus at all. But in fact, what you have is this structure that links the language of government and the public to race, which has long been true. It's been true about public health, public housing. So that's the ideology that we're facing. But the question is, can we change it? Can we change the resonance of public so people think it is coming to them? Things are not fixed forever. Now here, I mean, I'm the child of 2 Holocaust survivors. I try not to be optimistic, but this is what the optimist would say. That this is what Du Bois, the Du Bois of Black Reconstruction would say. That would be the, if you have huge government programs that do go to people in a way that makes them visibly see government is helping them, then it will reduce the base for a fascist movement. It won't eliminate it, because that's not really possible, but it will reduce its base.
So I'm going to say, here's the pessimistic part, and then I'll come to the optimistic part. The pessimistic part is that when we look at those people who stormed the Capitol of the United States, those were middle-class people. Those were entrepreneurs. Those are people who, excuse me?
Their own car dealerships.
Yeah, they had car dealers. They had the resources to get to Washington, D.C. They had all of those things. We saw that Trump actually underperformed with lower income people in relationship to Hillary, and that there were far more middle and upper income white people who were attracted to Trumpism. And they kind of slapped the face of populism on it to make it seem like there was some toothless rube who was being taken for a ride by the billionaire con man.
Wasn't that an age thing?
Excuse me?
Wasn't that an age thing, that Trump supporters were actually wealthier than Bernie's or Hillary's?
Yes, they were.
Older.
They were. Yes, yeah. True. They were, because they were older. Yeah. So I think that's one part of it. And the other pessimistic part of it is that, we have the example of the Affordable Care Act to see how people reacted. The Affordable Care Act did enroll people and did give people access to health care. And there are people who are still leading the charge, against it. They want to get rid of it because it was given to them by this socialist Black dude. But there is, I think, an optimistic side, which, it's always a question of which of these will win out, is that when we talk about populism in the United States, we default to the right-wing version of it. There is a progressive history of populism. In the past 5 years, we've talked a great deal about George Wallace, have talked very little about Henry Wallace, and the populism of 1948. We've talked very little about the first incarnation of the Populist Party and the interracial political movements of the late 19th century. Or you put Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign in there. You could put Jesse Jackson in 1984 in there. And I think that probably the best incarnation of that now is Reverend William Barber, with the tremendous work that he's doing around poverty and getting people to see past their differences. And so I think it's not a fait accompli. I think that it is possible. It's what time is it? It's 8:51 p.m. I've been up since 4 a.m. because one of my twins woke up. And so I just landed on the pessimistic side. So give me a meal and a little bit of sleep, and you have this conversation tomorrow, and I might land on the optimistic side.
I mean, Jelani's just 100% right that there's this phenomenon. Tim Snyder calls it pseudo-populism. Jonathan Metzl's book is called Dying of Whiteness, where People will vote against their own self-interest if it means that the minorities will, the hated minority will suffer more. And that is just documented again and again and again. But as Du Bois, as leftists in this country and elsewhere have always said, it is the point of the labor movement to respond to that. And we are seeing Black Lives Matter linked up with labor movements, is interlocked with labor movements. There's a large scale mass movement, cross-racial. Now, this might wish it into existence, but I do think there's a large scale cross-racial labor movement that is involved. The Black Lives Matter labor movement links. We saw West Virginia, the teachers strike. We're seeing the Amazon strike in Alabama. We're seeing a labor movement emerge. And when a labor movement emerges, things get better. And a labor movement's going to be cross-racial.
I think to add to your point, and to commit the sin of self-referencing again, I wrote a profile of Alicia Garza, who was one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And people don't know. People have scorned Black Lives Matter as "quote unquote" identity politics. Alicia's day job is as a labor organizer. Right. She organizes domestic workers. Yeah. And she said, when I talked to her about this, she said, I really don't understand what people say, what they mean when they say identity politics. She said, I'm doing what labor organizers have always done, organize the people who are on the bottom, the people who are being exploited. And she's like, if you see a commonality among those people, it is because our economy and our society is collating in such a way that when I'm organizing domestic workers, I'm also organizing a lot of undocumented folk. So we're now in this immigration conversation. And a lot of these are people of color. So this conversation about race. And we're organizing where we're seeing the vulnerabilities of trans people. And they're looking to the point that I was saying earlier about they're able to see all of these different movements and the connections between them and not in the siloed ways of previous generations. And so, that I thought that was the most effective response to the question about identity politics.
I was tempted to say you're using a term that's unfamiliar to me. What's a labor movement? But it seems like we actually might start having one again. And Jason, this may be our last question. You have said that let's not be diverted when we talk about fascism by skinheads and thugs. It's the leadership that matters. We now have a president of the United States who believes in democratic norms and nominal control of the Senate and the House by the Democratic Party. We do see a resurgence of things like unionizing drives. Yet, you are pessimistic. Explain.
Because the Republican Party has become an authoritarian far-right party. And one of your two major parties is an authoritarian far-right party, your country is in serious trouble.
I'll say one last thing as a kind of parting comment. One of the things that's interesting to me about the condition of the Republican Party and the circumstance that it finds itself in is that it has really painted itself into one hell of a demographic corner and one hell of an ideological corner. And so the kinds of pivots that they would need to make to expand their appeal are exactly the kinds that their base will not allow them to make right now. And I'll just give you one comparison. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Democratic Party was a right-wing, racially reactionary party. And he believed in some kind of popular ideas of labor and so on, but a white man's party. And the Great Migration took place. 5 million African Americans go from south to north. They go into places that are Democratic strongholds. In 1932 and 1936, they vote for FDR in significant numbers. All of a sudden, the Democrats realize not only do we have to worry about white Southerners we have to worry about these Black people who are living in our communities. Was enough for people, Branch Rickey, to look around Brooklyn and say there are a whole bunch of Black people who don't come to Dodger games. Integrated baseball on the basis of the dynamics of the Great Migration. And so the Democratic Party evolved and moved into what it currently is. We're now seeing increasing numbers of immigrants, significant numbers of immigrants, who might actually be favorable toward the Republican message on capitalism if they also didn't feel like they were hated. Increasing numbers of African Americans and significant voter turnout in ways that are able to do things like turn Georgia blue and 3 times defeat Republicans in Georgia. And kind of astounding development, the kind of breakup of the solidly red South as we're seeing all these demographic changes. The politically rational thing to do would be to pivot in the way that Marco Rubio, the first incarnation of Marco Rubio, before his spine was surgically removed, wanted to actually do, the direction he wanted to lead that party in. That would be the politically rational thing to do, but instead they've gone to the opposite direction.
Because they can't win a primary, and you've got to win a primary before you can win a general. So
sure, but the problem then becomes when you paint yourself into a demographic corner like that. Our 2-party system has collapsed twice before. The Federalists died and the Whigs died for problems that are strikingly similar to the kind of problems we see with the Republicans now. Not saying that they'll die, but I think that there is a significant really rocky road ahead of them because of these reasons.
I'm worried the significant rocky. I think the Republican Party has explicitly faced the fact that they don't have a way forward by voting, and they're going to employ. They're explicit about attacking democracy, and they might win.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
So, yeah. I mean, I do think and just your earlier point about how the Republican Party, if they had chosen a different path, could have been a majority party, more of a majority party. I mean, remember, Muslims were majority Republican before 9/11.
Wow.
So
I didn't know that.
I mean, George Bush was popular. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's true. I'll have to check it.
Well, we could do this all year, but it is 9 o'clock. And this has been an extraordinary discussion. I have totally enjoyed it. I hope that the viewers have enjoyed it. Thank you both so much for joining us. And I believe that Eric is going to come back and close us out. Is that true, Eric?
Can I say one quick thing?
Absolutely.
This is a shout out to the Mark Twain Library. I used to live in Connecticut on the same block. And so I literally lived a block away. And so I missed my old neighborhood there. And it's good to be with you all, even if it is virtually.
That's nice. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tina and Jelani.
On behalf of all sponsors and supporters who made this program possible, our deepest thanks to Dr. Jelani Cobb, Dr. Jason Stanley, and Tina Rosenberg. And special thanks especially to the staff of the Mark Twain Library who made this production possible. And folks, don't forget that this broadcast will be on the Mark Twain Library YouTube channel. And I'm sure it will be just as enlightening in rerun. And certainly thanks again to all who joined us tonight. Be well and stay safe. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.